and today's topic is going to be on winter invasive species survey tips. So my name is Douglas Knopf. I am the Invasive Species Project Specialist for the New York Natural Heritage Program on our Invasive Species Database team. And I will be going through today's topic. Just a few things before we get started. Again, today's webinar will be recorded. Everybody who registers and attends will be receiving a follow-up email that has a link to the recording for the webinar, as well as any links that I mentioned to any resources throughout the presentation. Everybody has their microphone muted, and I ask that you please remain muted throughout the duration of the presentation. If anybody has questions that you'd like to ask, you can put those in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. We'll have a little bit of time to review questions, or you can unmute at the end and ask any questions that you might have. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into it. So the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to be just doing a brief introduction, looking through some of the species that you'll want to be looking out for in the winter months, mostly focusing on terrestrial plant species as well as forest pests, how to effectively take photos of the different species, as well as a little bit of information on local programs that you can get involved with for invasive species volunteer programs around your area. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions as well. So a little bit of background, if you've been to any of the other webinars this year, you've heard this spiel before, but we are the New York Natural Heritage Program with an organization tasked with being the data collectors and record keepers for all of the rare, threatened, and endangered species and ecosystem types around New York State. And as one of the greatest threats to rare species is the establishment and spread of invasive species, New York State also established the Invasive Species Database Program under NYNHP. So this includes the overarching iMapInvasives database, as well as associated data collection tools and prioritization models and data analyses tools. So while all of our partner organizations are busy out in the summer months and field season collecting all of the data, our busy season starts around this time of year where we are going through all of that data, confirming and reviewing it, as well as updating our data sets for our various analyses tools. And although most of this data is collected during the summer months, there's still ample opportunity to continue to collect invasive species information throughout the winter months outside of the growing season. This is really dependent on whether or not we would be able to identify the species that you're out surveying for. So while most species throughout the growing season have their identifying characteristics that make them unique and easy to identify, a lot of that kind of dies back in the winter months and leaves them all looking like bare sticks or dead stalks. But there are still plenty of species that have those identifying characteristics that they retain throughout the winter months, or there are certain things that make them a little easier to look for during the winter. So there's certain things that make them easier, things like species that retain fruit throughout the wintering months, certain species that will hold onto their leaves a little bit longer. Most people know that invasive species will usually leaf out a little earlier in the spring. They'll be some of the first things to have bud break in the warmer months, March and April. But a lot of invasive species will also retain their leaves further into the winters. This time of year around Albany, where I'm based out of, most of the trees have already dropped a lot of their leaves for the season, but things like honeysuckle will still have healthy looking green leaves on them for a few more weeks. Identification might also be a little less obvious in some of the photos. It's harder to take an effective photo of some of these species without those flashy identifying characteristics. So it's also good to rely a little bit more on additional comments when you're collecting records for iMap. So photos are still critical and important, but you might not be able to capture everything in the photos. So making those additional comments for anything else that might help with species identification is very important. Things like if all of the leaves have already fallen off, describing the leaves that you see on the ground around the species, if there's any sort of identifying characteristics about them that would tie it to the species photographing, any sort of dried fruit that might be on the ground or still retained on the species themselves, and additional information about the form of the species. Things like the branching pattern, if it's opposite versus alternate, if it has thorns, any other identifying characteristics that might be helpful that won't be as obvious in the photos. So jumping into a few species, for the most part in the winter months, the easiest things to find are things that are going to, still be around, which for the most part is woody shrubs, things like your barberry, honeysuckle, burning bush, and different woody shrub species. Like I mentioned before, a lot of these species will hold onto their leaves a little bit later into the season or still have green leaves on them, which makes them stand out a little bit more against the native vegetation, which will lose their leaves. Um, and a lot of times the leaves on these species are important for identifying which of the species it is. It's also a lot easier to see them once all of the native trees have dropped all of their leaves. You get a more open view shed through like a forest system to see where these species are. And a lot of places in New York, a lot of forests don't really have much of a robust understory due to things like overbrowsing by deer. So if you're in an area where you see a whole bunch of shrubs that still have leaves on them in late November or December, there's a good chance that it's probably some sort of invasive species you might want to take a closer look at. A lot of these species, like I mentioned, also will retain fruit throughout the early winter, um, and they're typically foraged later on compared to native species. So obviously native wildlife, birds and mammals are more akin to eating the fruit off of native species, and they'll ignore the invasive species until further into the winter when there's not as much as that native forage left. Then they'll start going into, the barberry plants in your yard and eating the fruit off of those. So a few examples I have over on the right side here. Upper right-hand corner, Japanese barberry bush, very flashy red fruit that will retain throughout the winter. This is a very common landscape plant because people like that flash of color that it provides throughout the winter months. Over on the top left here, burning bush, similar fashion, has those red fruit that will retain. People like it more for the bright red foliage that it will have. And again, it has that foliage later on compared to a lot of the native species. So again, it has that flash of color, makes it a little bit easier to see out in wild systems. On the bottom right here, we have a multiflora rose. Again, bright red characteristic fruit on the end of the branches. Also sometimes hold on to their leaves a little bit later, so you'll be able to see things like the fringed stipules, which would be a good identifying characteristic during the growing month. You might still be able to see that in the early winter months as well. And then bottom left corner here is one of the Lonicera species, one of the invasive honeysuckles, and this photo was taken in mid-November. So again, once everything else has already kind of turned brown or dropped their leaves for the season, these invasive species can still hold on to their leaves and have them still be green and productive for several weeks to several months further down the line. I also put it over down in the bottom left corner because it's not technically a shrub, it's a vine, but Oriental bittersweet has very characteristic, flashy fruit that will be retained throughout the winter months. Those red fruit with the bright yellow capsules around them. Stands out very much in, amongst the brown sticks of all the native species that have lost their leaves and everything. I've also heard people concerned about the native variant. So yes, the Celastrus orbiculatus is the little bittersweet that's very common around New York, and there is a native variant, American bittersweet. It's not super common. It doesn't occur in that many areas in New York, but does still occur. The best way to tell them apart is by the color of that exterior capsule there. So on the invasive Oriental bittersweet, it'll be, kind of this dark yellow to bright orange color. And on the native variant of it, it will be a very dark orange to almost red color. It's a stark enough difference that if you're familiar with Oriental bittersweet and you come across the native American bittersweet, it'll stop you and make you wonder. It won't look quite right. If you are unsure about it, you can always report it to us. Again, that's why we review all the records that come in so we can take another look at it. Or if you have any concerns about it, whether or not it is the actual species, you can always put a comment in the comment section as well. The records. Another good thing for identification of woody shrubs in the wintertime is identification of the bark and the form of the plant. So just jumping down to the bottom here, if anybody is familiar with the old internet skit of Lenny Pepperbottom, it's a naturalist going around looking at trees, and he comes across an aspen tree and says, "You can tell it's an aspen because of the way it is." And ironically, that's kind of how it actually is for a lot of species identification. You can look at these plants and someone may ask, well, how do you know it's a buckthorn versus any other, brown stick-looking shrub in the wintertime with no leaves or anything on it? And it just kind of comes down to the more you look at it, the more you identify these things, the easier it becomes. You kind of train your eye on it. So while a lot of these things kind of look brown and unassuming at first, there are small nuances to each of the species that can help to identify them. So starting with common buckthorn, um, focus mostly on common buckthorn. Glossy buckthorn you won't really encounter as much because you're probably not going into those wet swampy areas where you commonly find that. Whereas common buckthorn is something you find more commonly like trail side in any forest preserve. So this is mostly focused on that. Common buckthorn plants usually have a dark coloration to the bark. The larger plants will start to get almost like a black cherry looking bark to it, kind of deeply furrowed, almost like burnt potato chips, the kind of texture to it. While the younger new growth on buckthorn, or kind of the younger plants themselves, usually when they're between like 1 to 2 inches in diameter, they'll still retain this look to them. They'll kind of have that dark bronze, shiny look to the bark, and they'll also be covered in these white horizontal lenticels. So the bottom left picture here is of a smaller buckthorn plant. And if you know your species, you might say it looks very similar to something like birch when it is younger as well, or things like hop hornbeam have a very similar look to them, just sort of that shiny, dull bronze color, and the lenticels across it. Good way to tell the uh, difference between that and buckthorn is you can kind of scratch away at these little horizontal lenticels there, and you'll see sort of a bright orange color underneath. A lot of the invasive shrub species in New York have this bright orange color underneath their bark. Buckthorn is one of them. So if you scratch away at the lenticels with your fingernail or with a pocket knife or something like that, you'll see that bright orange color start to come out. The twigs of the buckthorn as well kind of have a little bit of a characteristic shape to them. Up in the upper left here in the palm of this person's hand, you'll kind of notice at the end of the twigs, there'll be almost like a little pseudo thorn at the end of these branches. Not real thorns, but the way that the twig kind of comes to a taper is very sharp. For things like honeysuckle species, so there are 7 different species of bush honeysuckle that we track in New York for iMapInvasives. A lot of them look very similar even when they are fully leafed out, but when they don't have their leaves, they look even more similar. There are small changes to the bark color, bark texture, but in general, all the bush honeysuckle species will have this pale brown to tan colored bark. As they get older, you'll have these deeper furrows kind of going vertically in the bark. And as they get larger, a lot of the species will start to have exfoliating bark. So it'll kind of start to slough off in these long strips and kind of have a shaggy, papery look to it, similar to almost like a hickory tree, but a lot softer and easy to peel off. The number one best identifying characteristic for honeysuckle, if you are about out if it's a native honeysuckle bush versus an invasive is by cutting into one of the twigs and looking to see if it has a hollow pith. So down in the bottom right here, this is a twig that's probably 2 to 3 years old on an invasive honeysuckle. And you can see that the middle of the stick has a hollow pith to it. And if it were a native honeysuckle species, that would be filled. You wouldn't be able to really look through it. It would kind of have like a spongy orange pith to it. But on all of the invasive honeysuckle species, they'll have this hollow pith. Moving on to autumn olive species. So the bark of this, typically more lighter gray color, starts off smooth and kind of gets a little more furrowed as it gets older. Towards the midsection here and towards the bottom, you can see it kind of gets these deep furrows into it, which can kind of make it look similar to like an oak. And then in the middle here, this is kind of like raised, almost like lenticels, more similar to like an ash or a young hackberry species. Some characteristics that set it apart from these native species, again, the general form of it will be a lot more shrub-like. So instead of growing straight up, it'll kind of be leaning to one way or the other. Or a good surefire identification is by looking at the twigs. So the new growth at the end of the autumn olive branches, you'll kind of see this like a shiny silvery undercolor to the bark, and it'll be covered in these small orange to brown speckles all along the new growth there. And those speckles are on the new growth of the twigs, the buds, the petioles of the leaves, and the backs of the leaves themselves. So if you get out at this time of year and there's still some healthy leaves on the olive, you can use those to identify it as well. It'll have that silvery undercolor and then covered in those orange speckles as well. And then finally for burning bush, the thing that I mentioned before, the bright red foliage, obviously very telling of the species, makes it stand out amongst the background. But if all the leaves have fallen off and it's later in winter, looking at the twigs themselves for the presence of wings. So another common name for burning bush is winged euonymus, and it'll have these corky ridges that run along the twigs. So on the newer growth, primarily it's the easiest to see. The bark itself will be kind of a dark green color, and it will have these brown wings running along the twigs. And these can vary in size from, a half-inch raised from the bark itself to just like a thin brown line that kind of runs along the surface of it that you can kind of feel if you run your finger over it, but it might just look like a brown stripe along it. Typically, the ornamental variants will have very defined wings, and then when it escapes into a natural system and kind of reverts back to its natural way, it will have less defined wings. But there still should be a little bit of evidence on that on the twigs. And again, I'm not going to be going through each of the species that is easy to survey for in the winter months. There's still plenty of other woody shrubs that you can look for in winter months. These are just some of the more common ones or easy to identify characteristics for those species. So moving past the woody shrubs into the herbaceous species, even though they fully die back in the winter, there's still evidence that they leave behind that you can still photograph and report to iMap, or there's even some species that will live throughout the winter underneath the snow and look as green as they did in the middle of the summer. So for species that will fully die back and kind of leave that dead stalk in the winter months, some of them are identifiable enough that you can still submit them as the species that you believe they are. In the upper left here, we have Phragmites, common side of the road species. You can still identify that as, Phragmites. Similar to Phragmites, there are things like silver grasses, where you might not be able to fully identify exactly which species it is, and we do track several different silvergrass species. So for cases like that, silvergrass or knotweed, you might want to submit it as genus species unknown. So, if you go to an area and you see a bunch of these dead knotweed stems and you want to report it, best thing to do is to report it as knotweed species unknown. And that way it can still be confirmed in the database and will show up on the public map. If you were to submit this photo here in the top right and say that it's Japanese knotweed, we have no way of really being able to confirm that based on the photos because all of those identifying characteristics, like the shape of the leaves or the flowers, are not present. So we won't be able to confirm those records. So if there is an option to do genus species unknown in the winter months, that's generally the better option. Down here in the bottom left, this is teasel. We have a few species of teasel that we track as well. Same thing for that. In the winter months, you kind of just get these tall, dead brown stalks and flower heads. So it's best to just say, teasel species unknown for that, and it can still get into the database. For some of the species that persist in the cold, again, they'll look like they do the same in the summer months, and you can report them as such. Bottom right-hand corner here is the juvenile garlic mustard, and this photo was taken in December. They just kind of look like that all year long. In certain areas, there will be microclimates, or some areas will stay a little bit warmer for a little bit longer, especially next to large bodies of water like the Great Lakes or a large pond or something near you. All that water will soak up the heat from the summer and the area around it will stay a little bit warmer. So you might see species there that have stayed alive a little bit longer into the winter months compared to other areas. So it might be worth looking around there to see if there's any species that are still alive. These photos down here from just last week, I went up into the Adirondacks. There was 6 inches of snow and it was actively snowing when I took these photos, but this is watercress that is still green and healthy and growing in a drainage ditch. I also saw there was knapweed growing. There was, again, 6 inches of snow, but there were knapweed plants that were still flowering, poking through the snow. So certain herbaceous species will persist a little bit longer into the winter months that you can still keep a lookout for. Besides the terrestrial plants, another good group of species to be on the lookout for are forest pests. In general, there's a lot of pests that are good to survey for in the winter months because you're not looking for other things. And a lot of these pests are either easier to identify in the winter months or they have a general lower risk of spread in the winter months. So as an insect, it will be less likely to be active in the winter months. You'll have less chance of inadvertently spreading it from site to site, um, or they might be more charismatic in the winter months. So a few examples of species that we track in the database. One that probably everybody is very familiar with, the hemlock woolly adelgid, HWA, on the bottom right here. Balsam woolly adelgid, or BWA, in the top left here. And then something that we just started tracking this year. It's been present in New York for a number of decades, but wasn't really specifically tracked or closely monitored, but was added earlier this year as an invasive species to the iMap database, is red pine bast, or red pine scale, which is a very similar look to both HWA and BWA in that it has this woolly covering and grows on red pines. So obviously for these three, the biggest tell is the host species that you find it growing on and what part of the plant that you find it growing on. So hemlock woolly adelgid, these white woolly masses that are found on the underside of hemlock needles right at the base of the needle. For balsam woolly adelgid, this would be found on the face of the balsam fir trees. So actually growing out of the bark itself. And then for red pine bast, again, this is kind of similar to hemlock woolly adelgid, and then it's kind of at the base of the needles there, And the way that red pine trees grow, typically you only have needles on the very ends of the branches. So kind of looking at those branch ends for these white woolly masses. A few other species, forest pests that you can be on the lookout in during the winter months. Things like emerald ash borer. Obviously, the insects are going to be less active during that season, so you don't have to worry about the insects spreading around as much. The one thing to keep in mind is firewood. Obviously, during the colder months, people are going to be cutting down trees for firewood, so practicing good um, spread prevention methods with that. Not moving any materials or cutting down trees and moving it from the original site, especially if you find any evidence of emerald ash borer. But the identifying characteristics to look for and photograph to submit to iMap, things like the D-shaped exit hole. So in the upper right-hand corner here, this is the exit hole after the emerald ash borer larva has you know, grown and is ready to emerge as an adult. This is what you look for in the bark. And then for trees that are fully dead or you're able to remove the bark of, you'll be looking for these insect galleries. So those insect larvae are feeding on the cambium of the tree right underneath the bark, and they'll leave sort of these squiggly S-shaped galleries as they feed their way up the cambium layer. So if you see dead ash and you can't really see the distinct D-shaped exit holes. Maybe it's been dead for a while and the woodpeckers have been at it. You can't really tell if the holes are D-shaped or not. If you can peel away the bark fully and look for these galleries, that's another surefire way to see if it's um, emerald ash borer or not. For beech leaf disease, this is one that's commonly spreading around all over New York at this point. And while it is easiest to look for in the summer months, while the leaves are out and you're able to look up through the canopy, since American beech trees do hold onto their leaves throughout a lot of the winter months, you can still look at those to see if there's any of that characteristic dark banding on the leaves. So in the top left here, there's an example of a um, beech leaf that had beech leaf disease on it, and sort of these darker stripes in between the leaf veins will let you know that tree was affected with beech leaf disease. So if you're able to submit a photo like this, we'd still be able to confirm that it is beech leaf disease in those photos. And also on the topic of beech, there is beech scale, which is commonly known as beech bark disease. This is one that was not previously tracked in iMapInvasives and was added earlier this month. So if you're in an area where you know that beech bark disease is common, this is kind of a data gap species for us right now. And then other insect species that are more outwardly observable by laying egg masses on the outside of trees, things like spongy moth or spotted lanternfly. So down in the bottom left here, you can see the spongy moth egg masses on the outside of a birch tree. And then if you are in a part of the state where spotted lanternfly is common, being on the lookout for any of those egg masses as well. Okay, so those are the species. And moving on to photographing species. So like during the summer month, most important thing about taking photos for these species is being able to tell what it is in the photo that you're submitting. All the records that come into iMap have to be verified by an expert. And if we look at the photo and don't know what it's a picture of, we can't verify the species. In the winter months, this is especially challenging. You don't really have like a broad leaf to focus on. A lot of times you just have like a stick or a dead shrub that you're trying to take a picture of. So making sure that the photos that you're taking are, sharp, in focus. Good light is always a challenge during winter months as well when you go outside at 4 p.m. and the sun has already set. So if there's things like, distinct colorations that you want to comment on, but you don't really come out very well in the photo because it's a little bit too dark, again, writing those down into the comment section is important. Using the genus species unknown when it's appropriate. So this is just a list of some of the species that we have that option for: knapweeds, knotweeds, honeysuckles, barberry, teasels, privets, and oleasters. Oleasters being your autumn olive, Russian olive, things like that. So for these species, if you're not able to tell exactly what species it is, but you can get it down to the genus, you can just submit it as the genus species unknown, and we'll still be able to confirm it. And again, if there's any other additional comments that you want to put into the comment section for identification, do so as well. And I mentioned a little bit about this with the Emerald dashboard, but this goes for all species. During the winter months, a lot of invasive species have produced their seeds and they might still be around. So, practicing good spread prevention measures, not moving any invasive species materials or plants, um, cleaning off your boots if you're going from one site to another, being wary of any sort of craft projects that you might be doing this time of year. I know a lot of people like to make like centerpieces out of these various invasive species. They might have the heads of silvergrass or Phragmites. The photo up here in the top left, the teasel, people like to take those for different crafting projects. But just being mindful that these are invasive species and they still have the potential to spread via seeds, especially end of winter when you're ready to throw them out and you just toss them out into the yard. There is that potential for spread. And again, good photos on the right side here. If you're taking a picture of a teasel, making sure that it's focus, it's a sharp image, well lit. There's not too much going on in the background, so you're able to see the full species. And then this picture in the bottom right here, this is another species that was, or another photo that was submitted with teasel species. And if you take a quick look at it and try to find this teasel, give people a quick second to look for it. This is an example of a photo that's just a little bit too busy for us to really find what you're looking for. If you were looking for it, there's where the teasel is. You probably still can't really see it that well. But just making sure that the thing you're photographing is actually the centerpiece and the focal point of the photo is an important thing for us. And then a little bit of information on volunteer programs. So a lot of the partnerships for regional invasive species management across the state continue to do volunteer programs throughout the winter months. In areas of the state where things like hemlock woolly adelgid are still a species of high priority, a lot of those prisms will have these specific programs dedicated to that species. Um, the other prisms will still have various volunteer programs that go on throughout the winter months. They might not be focused on a specific species, but most of the prisms will still be running things like webinars or guided hikes throughout the winter months that you can still sign up for and contribute invasive species data for. Hemlock woolly adelgid is just one of our really big one that we do a lot of community engagement for. The prisms get a lot of volunteers from their local areas to survey, looking for this insect. The New York State Hemlock Initiative does a lot of work with it as well. They have their various community science programs for it as well. And iMapInvasives also runs a annual Hemlock woolly adelgid mapping challenge. This usually runs from the beginning of February through mid-March. We have the Hemlock woolly adelgid page up at this point on our website. It hasn't been updated with this year's information yet for the upcoming challenge, but ahead of that, it will be updated. And then for anybody who is interested in getting in touch with their local PRISM or learning more about the volunteer opportunities that they have, if you haven't done so already, we suggest signing up for their listservs. This is also how iMapInvasives sends out our webinar announcement emails for our monthly webinar series. So if you're interested in learning more about your local PRISM and volunteer opportunities, you can go to nias.info/PRISM listserv. Again, I'll include this link on the follow-up email that I send at the end of the webinar, and you can sign up for email alerts for those. This is an example of one of the PRISM Hemlock woolly adelgid programs. This is for the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake Ontario or SLELO PRISM, and just a breakdown of the different events that they have. So that'll start out with a Hemlock woolly adelgid identification and iMapInvasives webinar to train you how to identify the species and use the software, followed up with a field trip to go identify Hemlock woolly adelgid out in the field, and then they'll be planning a series of guided survey hikes throughout the winter months. So you can, reach out to your local prism or see what sort of events they have going on throughout the winter to get involved with. Or you can just get in touch with your local prism to learn more about the species around you that you would want to be looking for. And again, this is just one of the examples of the prisms. All the different prisms have volunteer events going on throughout the winter months. And I just want to shout out as well our help resources library. So if you are interested in conducting invasive species surveys and you want to use our surveying tools, our data collection tools, if you want to get more information on species identification, we have all this information in our help resources library and in our training page. Our training page especially has links to a lot of different invasive species identification resources. So if you want to learn more about the identifying characteristics of species that are common around you, I suggest going to our training page. If you want to learn more about how to use our data collection software or database software, going to our help resources library.